Perhaps the British are culturally more accepting of authority, or perhaps recondite molecular mumbo-jumbo was just more likely to rub Americans the wrong way. But in any case, the introduction of DNA fingerprinting into the United States was highly controversial. The law has always had difficulty assimilating the implications, if not the very idea, of scientific evidence. Even the most intelligent lawyers, judges, and juries have customarily found it difficult to understand at first. In one famous early instance of forensic courtroom drama, blood typing had unequivocally ruled out Charlie Chaplin as the father of a child whose mother had slapped a paternity suit on the silent screen legend. The jury nevertheless ruled in the mother's favor. American courts had long applied the Frye test as their standard for admissibility of scientific evidence. Based on one of the first trials to introduce forensic proof, it tries to keep out unreliable evidence by requiring that the science on which it is based, quote, must be sufficiently established to have gained general acceptance in the particular field in which it belongs, end of quote. But being based on a poor understanding of what constitutes well-established science, the test proved an ineffective way of determining the credibility of expert testimony. It was not until 1993, in Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, that the Supreme Court ruled the federal rules of evidence should be used. The judge in a trial should determine whether the proffered evidence is reliable, i.e., whether it can be trusted as scientifically valid. Nowadays, with court TV an established part of the television landscape, and with primetime series focusing on forensic investigations a staple of the networks, it may be hard to appreciate how difficult it was for the American legal system to swallow DNA. Though everyone had been hearing about it since our landmark discovery in 1953, it still had about it an impenetrable scientific aura. Indeed, the field of genetics seemed only more arcane every time the popular media hailed a new advance. Perhaps worst of all was the fact that DNA-supported charges were presented not as dead certainties, but as probabilities. And what probabilities they were. With figures like 1 in 50 billion bandied about to establish the guilt or innocence of the accused, little wonder some questioned the value of lawyers, judges, juries, and expensive trials when a geneticist, wrapped in the authority of science, could settle a case. But at all events, most trials depend on more than the comparison of two DNA samples. Meanwhile, the acceptance of the new methods progressed slowly but ineluctably. In some sense, the cause of broader understanding and acceptance was aided by lawyers who made their name challenging the very cases that depended on DNA evidence. Skilled attorneys like Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld became as knowledgeable as the experts they were cross-examining. Scheck, short, messy, and pugnacious, and Neufeld, tall, tidy, and pugnacious, gained attention searching for technical flaws in cases presented during the early days of genetic fingerprinting. The two first met in 1977 as colleagues at the office of the Bronx Legal Aid Society, a local center of legal advocacy for the indigent. After growing up in New York City, the son of a successful impresario who managed stars like Connie Francis, Scheck found his political calling when he went to college at Yale, taking part in the national student strike that followed the Kent State shootings in 1970. Ever suspicious of entrenched authority and the abuse of power, he volunteered to assist Bobby Seale's defense team during the Black Panthers trial in New Haven. Peter Neufeld grew up in suburban Long Island, where his mother still lives, not far from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. He was no less precocious in his leftward leanings, having been reprimanded in the 11th grade for organizing anti-war protests. It was little surprise when the two young, bred-in-the-bone social progressives became crusading lawyers, manning the barricades of legal aid in New York City, in a tumultuous moment in the life of the city, when rising crime rates made justice for all seem to some an ideal endangered in the pursuit of public safety. A decade later, Scheck would be professor at Cardozo School of Law, and Neufeld would be in private practice. I first met Scheck and Neufeld at an historic conference on DNA fingerprinting held at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. The controversy was at its height, in part because the forensic technology was being applied more and more broadly, despite still being done with Jeffries' as yet unrefined original technique, the arcane-sounding analysis of restriction fragment length polymorphisms, or RFLPs. Inevitably, some results were difficult to interpret, and so DNA fingerprinting was being challenged on technical and legal grounds. The Cold Spring Harbor gathering was actually the first occasion on which molecular geneticists, including Alec Jeffries, would confront the forensic specialists and lawyers now using DNA in the courtroom. The discussions were heated. The molecular geneticists accused the forensic scientists of sloppy laboratory techniques, of simply not doing the testing carefully enough. Indeed, in those days, DNA fingerprinting in forensic laboratories was subject to little, if any, regulation or oversight. There were also challenges to the statistical assumptions, likewise unstandardized, used to calculate those imposing numbers, suggesting virtual certainty. The geneticist, Eric Lander, spoke for more than a few concerned participants when he proclaimed bluntly, "The implementation of DNA fingerprinting has been far too hasty." These practical problems were typified in a case Scheck and Neufeld were working on in New York. Joseph Castro was accused of murdering a pregnant woman and her 2-year-old daughter. RFLP analysis, performed by a company called Life Codes, had established that a bloodstain on his wristwatch was from the murdered mother. After a sustained examination of the DNA data, however, the expert witnesses of both the prosecution and defense jointly informed the judge in a pretrial hearing that, in their view, the DNA tests had not been done competently. The judge excluded the DNA evidence as inadmissible. The case never came to trial because Castro pleaded guilty to the murders in late 1989. Despite the exclusion of the DNA evidence, the Castro case helped establish the legal standards for genetic forensics. These were the standards that would be applied in a much more prominent case Scheck and Neufeld were to take on, one that would make DNA fingerprinting a household term in America, and indeed everywhere one could find a television. The trial of O.J. Simpson in 1994. The former sports icon was facing a possible death penalty if convicted of the heinous crime he was charged with by the Los Angeles District Attorney, the gory murder of Simpson's ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. As part of the legal dream team assembled by the accused, Scheck and Neufeld would make critical contributions to Simpson's defense and acquittal. Forensic detectives had collected bloodstains from the crime scene at Nicole Brown Simpson's house, from O.J. Simpson's house, from an infamous glove and sock, and from Simpson's equally infamous